There's an old 18th century ruin that sits on top of a hill overlooking the West Yorkshire countryside. It's known by a few different names, centering around the figure most commonly associated with it, Black Dick of the North, whose real name was Sir Richard Beaumont. This sorry-looking ruin is known as Black Dick's Tower, the Folly, Whitley Beaumont Temple, or just the Temple, and it's rumoured to be haunted by the ghost of Richard Beaumont himself. Okay, first of all, get it out of your system. Dick is a nickname for Richard, and this particular Richard, who I'm going to be talking about a lot today, has the nickname Black Dick. Get the laughs out now. Go on. You ready? Okay, I'll start. So while the temple is the only structure still standing now, it used to be part of a whole estate, Whitley Beaumont. These lands had been given to William Bellamont, an ancestor of the Beaumont family, around the very early 1200s. And you can kind of see it, can't you? Bellamont, Beaumont. He had been presented the lands by the Lord of Pontefract Castle, a Roger de Lacy, after Bellamont's contribution to the Crusades. And so this was the family seat of the Beaumonts for generations. Obviously, they would have built a house here. We don't know for sure, but it seems pretty likely you'd need a house to, live in. We do know that there was a house here by the 1400s, and this house, known as Whitley Beaumont, was added to and remodelled as the Beaumonts carried on living, dying, and passing it on to the next generation here. And there is an important Beaumont that is obviously going to feature heavily in this story tonight, and that is, of course, Sir Richard Beaumont. He was born in 1574 and actually seemed to get up to quite a lot in his life. It's mentioned a lot online that he was knighted in 1609 by King James I, but I actually found his name recorded in the book The Knights of England, which said it was on the 23rd of July 1603, Richard Beaumont became a knight bachelor, which is a knight, so you get the Sir title, but it's like the most basic entry-level knighthood you can get. Still, very impressive. And it's thought that it was James I who gave Richard Beaumont the nickname Black Dick of the North, because of his dark hair and kind of like swarthy looks. Richard, along with a local rector, William Alexander Stock, also helped to fund and set up a free grammar school for boys in the area in 1610, just giving back to the community. He was also military-minded. In 1613, he commanded a battalion of troops at Kirkeaton, which is not too far away from Whitley Beaumont. And he was also apparently treasurer for a group of disabled soldiers who'd been injured in battle. So all around, so far, just seemed like a stand-up guy, right? In 1625, he became a member of Parliament for Pontefract, and then 3 years later, in 1628, he was awarded the title of Baronet of Whitley by King Charles I. And on the surface, it appears that he was a very wealthy, successful man. He obviously owned the Whitley Beaumont estate, but he also had Sandal Castle near Wakefield. And as man of the house at Whitley Beaumont, he spent a load of money to basically completely rebuild it in the 17th century. But there is apparently another side to Sir Richard Beaumont, which has made its way into the legend. And it's that the name Black Dick isn't because of the official explanation that Richard was this swarthy, tall, dark and handsome chap. It was actually because of his proclivities towards the darker side of life, in that he was super into his gambling, loved his card games and cockfights, was a bit of a womanizer, and made some shady deals that landed him in a bunch of debt. And to get out of this debt, he actually moonlighted as a highwayman to try and pay off the guys that he owed money to. He'd had 2 illegitimate daughters with his mistress, but there was also another rumour that he allegedly murdered one of his serving girls whom he'd taken as another mistress because she'd fallen pregnant. But perhaps most relevant to this story, he had used that tower on the hill, the temple, to practice black magic and dark rituals. The story goes on to say that Black Dick was beheaded in a duel on the 5th of July 1631 after a disagreement about his bad debts and owing money to the wrong people. After his death, he died unmarried and without a male heir to pass his estates on to, so Whitley Beaumont passed to a relative, Sir Thomas Beaumont, and so continued the passing down of Whitley Beaumont estate. In the 18th century, at some point, the house was extensively remodelled again into the house that we can see from the early photographs that have survived, and at this point, it was now the very much your standard Georgian stately home. To give you an idea of how important and grand this estate actually was, at some point in the 1700s, Bonnie Prince Charlie apparently stayed here, the guy who led the failed attempt at restoring the Stuart family onto the British throne, and who eventually had to live out the rest of his life in exile. Quite an important figure in British history. Again, the estate continued to be passed down until the 6th of October 1913, when the last of the Beaumont family to live in the house, Henry Frederick Beaumont, died. The house stood empty after that, and none of the rest of the family really wanted anything to do with it. Like a lot of stately family homes at the time, they'd become these huge, great big demonstrations of wealth, and they were big and old. By that time, the early 20th century, the surviving family couldn't really afford, or didn't want to spend the extortionate money on, maintaining what had been their ancestral family home. In May 1916 and a year later in 1917, the fittings and furniture of the house were auctioned off, and the house itself was in complete disrepair by this point. The rooms were all damp and mouldy, the grounds were pretty much wilderness, and even the stable block had burned down at some point, but there had been no attempts to rebuild it. In August of 1924, it was decided that the house was going to be demolished to gain access to a coal seam that the hall was sitting on, but instead it was basically saved by a guy called Charles Sutcliffe, who was under no illusions of what he had just bought. He called it his shooting box, as that was all it was really good for. There was no electricity, so when he would host his friends for dinner parties and things, it would be done by candlelight. He still made the best of it though. He was a member of the Rockwood Hunt and would host the hunt balls here at Whitley Beaumont. During the Second World War, the grounds of the estate were loaned out to the army for soldier camps and training manoeuvres, and Black Dick's tower, being in such a strategic position on the hill, would be used to look out for enemy planes flying overhead. Charles Sutcliffe would pass away in 1948 though, and after that in the 1950s, the estate was sold to a mining company. The house was sold for £2,500 and the land around it, all of the grounds of the estate, for £20,000. They pulled the house down to get at the coal seam underneath it, and now the area is operated as an open cast mine. But there were parts of the old estate that were saved, and that includes the area that Black Dick's tower sits on. And so today that's all that's left of Whitley Beaumont estate, although the tower itself is in a pretty bad way. But that doesn't stop people from making the journey up the hill, especially on the 5th of July, to try and catch a glimpse of the alleged paranormal activity. Because it's said that Richard Beaumont, the infamous Black Dick, returns to the temple on the 5th of July, the anniversary of his beheading, to haunt the location where he supposedly carried out these dark rituals. And he appears as a headless figure, carrying his own head under his arm. Other people have claimed to see a figure of a man wearing clothes, which would have been the fashion around Richard Beaumont's time, and he sat on a black horse, just standing there, staring at them. When this mysterious horse and rider disappear, they don't leave behind any hoof prints. People who have done paranormal investigations in this area have also reported feeling a super oppressive atmosphere. But is that more to do with the fact that they're out there with the express intention of capturing something paranormal? Maybe. But these weren't the only ghost stories that have been reported in the area. Because apparently, while the Whitley Beaumont house was still standing, it was allegedly haunted by its very own White Lady ghost. And I don't know anything else about this figure, and obviously the house isn't standing anymore, so whether she still haunts the grounds or even the mine now, don't know. The area is super close to Robin Hood's alleged grave too, literally like 15 minutes away, which I think I might have to do a whole special episode on Robin Hood because there are so many ghost stories surrounding his legend that it would just be too much to get into here. But the point I'm trying to make is that this area has a lot of legend, a lot of folklore, and of course a lot of ghost stories attached to it. And for the purists among you who are screaming at your device right now because I missed out massive parts of Sir Richard Beaumont's story, don't worry, I have actually done my research. Because all the history I've told you up to now is the version of the story which supports the ghostly sightings of Sir Richard. But now I'm going to tell you the actual history, because the story that we've got recorded in factual evidence does not support the alleged ghost stories. And I'm starting off with a big one, his debts. It may very well have been true that Sir Richard Beaumont liked a bit of gambling from time to time, but was he in so much debt to the extent that he needed to resort to highway robbery to pay off his debts? It's pretty unlikely. This guy was the one who did extensive remodelling to the house. That wouldn't have been cheap. And to even be able to accept the title of becoming Baronet of Whitley, which he did in 1628, he'd have to pay a fee of over £1,000. These investments don't seem to me to be the behaviour of a man who would throw away all of his money on cards and cockfights. I don't know. Maybe he was outwardly portraying a lifestyle that his bank balance couldn't support, and maybe that was the debt that he was in. But to resort to being a highwayman, I don't think so. There was also talk online about him being made Justice of the Peace, which then kind of seems to be very contradictory to the story, doesn't it? For him to be both judge in the court of law and a raging criminal. Not completely impossible, I guess, just unlikely. And then his womanizing, the rumour that he killed a pregnant serving girl who was carrying his kid. Also to me, seems pretty unlikely. It is true that he had two illegitimate daughters, Isabella Lees and Isabella Bromswood, with his mistress Mary Lewis. But both kids were with the same woman. Yes, he died unmarried and could very well have been known to chase a bit of tail, but there really is no evidence to suggest that he killed a serving girl. He already had those two illegitimate daughters. He'd already broke the social norms of the time. Really, was it going to be such a leap to have another illegitimate child? Okay, she's a serving girl, but you see where I'm coming from. So again, not impossible, but just doesn't seem to be completely accurate. And then his death. The way it's told in the legend, it does not add up with the evidence. Because when Richard Beaumont did die, he was interred at the Beaumont Chapel in Kirkeaton Church, and his tomb is still there today, complete with his tombstone or plaque or whatever that spills the real story, in that he died on the 28th of October 1631, not the 5th of July. And this story about him being beheaded was actually a mix-up of stories with another story involving his great-grandfather, Robert de Beaumont. In 1341, Richard's great-granddad Robert was beheaded by a guy called John de Eland, while Robert was in his bed at Crosland Hall. The story goes that John and his men had camped out near Crosland Hall, waited for the morning, and then ambushed the hall when the drawbridge was lowered to let a serving girl out. So Black Dick didn't lose his head, and the real story was part of the Beaumont family, but didn't take place at Whitley Beaumont and had nothing to do with Richard, really. And finally, the tower itself. I promise, after this, I'll stop being so negative about this story, but it is a good story, like very creepy, just complete folklore. Because obviously the part of the legend goes that the reason that the ghost of Richard Beaumont comes back to the temple is because this is the place where he used to do his black magic rituals and things, right? Richard Beaumont died in 1631. The tower wasn't built until 1752, over 100 years after Richard had died. So it's believed to have just been a summer house, with a nice glass roof, a nice landmark on the estate from where you can host lavish garden parties and family picnics. No black magic required. So while the story of Richard Beaumont and the Whitley Beaumont Temple don't seem to quite add up to the ghost stories that have been passed down for generations, that doesn't mean that perhaps there isn't something else here instead. And for all these years, Richard Beaumont has been taking the spotlight when the identity of the real apparition that haunts these grounds has been lost to time. We will perhaps never know, but tell me your thoughts. What do you think? I feel like it's a very optimistic believer thing of me to say that it is still haunted and just maybe not by the person we've been told it is. But let's not forget that there were Beaumonts here for hundreds of years. This was the house where they were born, lived and died. In reality, the story around Richard Beaumont doesn't add up at all. But that's not to say that there isn't something else on these grounds, angry that their ancestral family home has been torn down to mine the coal from underneath it, like anything like that. Because obviously there are people, no identifying details other than that they're people, but people nonetheless, saying that they've seen a beheaded chap wandering about near the tower. Who could that be? I don't know. I don't think we're ever really going to know for sure. And you've got to consider the fact that maybe their imaginations have just run away with them and they're seeing something that they're expecting to see, knowing the legend of the area and of Richard Beaumont. But between these unnamed witnesses and paranormal investigators that have been up to the temple on the 5th of July, a lot of people are adamant that this place is haunted. I don't really think so myself. The history just doesn't add up, and then take the inaccuracies out of the story and you're not really left with much to go on. But I'm more than happy to be proven wrong in the comments. If you've had an experience here yourself, which was just too weird to explain up by the Whitley Beaumont Temple, please do let me know. But if you enjoyed this video, please click the little like button. And if you want to support me, just make sure you're subscribed. It honestly really does help. But anyway, that is all from me today. It was quite a short one, short and sweet, but hopefully leaving you with something to chew on, something to think about. I want to know your thoughts. Please do tell me them in the comments. And I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. They're just cardboard boxes. They're not stable enough for you to be jumping on them. You're gonna cover me in cat hair now, aren't you? There's an old 18th century ruin that sits on top of a hill overlooking... Oh, Bean!